Aston Martin makes some of the best and most iconic cars, but they haven't always had an easy time. Far from the glitz and the glamour of Formula 1, they've gone bust 7 times and swapped hands many times. This is the troubled tale of Aston Martin. Aston Martin was founded in 1913 by Raimond Martin and Robert Bamford. They had previously worked together under the name Bamford & Martin, selling singers and servicing vehicles at a garage in London. Raimond Martin raced at Aston Hill in Buckinghamshire and decided to build his own car. The first car under the Aston Martin name was created when a 4-cylinder Coventry simplex engine was fitted to the chassis of an Isotta Fraschini. Bamford left in 1920 after the war, and the business got funding from Count Louis Borowski, a racing driver. Racing cars built for the French Grand Prix broke world records at Brooklands in 1922. Around 55 cars were made, and they were based on the racing cars which had so much success. Bamford & Martin went bankrupt in 1924, and Bamford had to sell the business to Lady Charnwood. They struggled financially the next year, and the business was sold again, with Bill Renwick and Augustus Bertelli taking over, with Charnwood still having some equity in the business. It was renamed to Aston Martin Motors, and production moved to Feltham. Bertelli was involved in building and developing the cars, and new models such as the T-Type, International, Le Mans, and the Ulster were produced. The company again ran into money problems, and Lance Prideaux-Brun owned the company for a year before it was taken over by Sir Arthur Sutherland. The business shifted to focusing on road cars. They were forced to make aircraft parts during the Second World War. David Brown Limited, a gear and machines tools manufacturer, bought Aston Martin in 1947, as well as Lagonda, starting their long-lasting partnership. Due to Brown saving the business, the initials DB were used on their models, starting with the DB2 in 1950, with the DB Mark III in 1957 and the DB4 the following year, which helped to make the company a household name. The DB5, which was famously driven by James Bond, also helped to cement Aston Martin as a desirable brand, began production in 1963, with the DB6 and DBS following, as they tried to capitalise fully off the success of the spy film. This newfound fame couldn't stop the financial demise of the brand, as David Brown had to pay off the £5 million of debt in 1972, and he let go of the business for just £101 the same year. The business was put in the hands of Company Developments, an investment consortium led by William Wilson. It was challenging for this group, as the business was hurt by worldwide economic recession from 1973 to 1975 and a lack of capital. Furthermore, US sales stopped as they were unable to meet California's emissions regulations. The brand was put into receivership in 1974 and the manufacturing plant was closed. In 1975, the business was sold to 3 businessmen, Peter Sprague, George Minden and Jeremy Turner, for just over £1 million. 2 more investors, Alan Curtis and George Flaver, were later brought in. The factory was reopened later that year under the new name Aston Martin Lagonda Limited. There were only 100 staff, less than a quarter of the previous number, but it rose to 250 by the end of the year. The new owners caused big change in the brand, with modern designs on new cars, such as the V8 Vantage, Volante and the Lagonda. Prices also increased by 25%, with speculation Aston would buy Lamborghini. This never came to fruition, but they also tried to buy MG. This was again unsuccessful, despite MPs attempting to pressure British Leyland into selling the brand. CH Industrials bought a 10% stake in Aston. It all looked to be going well, but this would not be the case for long. In July 1980, Aston laid off nearly 100 people, cutting their workforce by 20%. This was due to recession, which had nearly ended the business 6 years ago. Victor Gauntlet of Pace Petroleum bought a 12.5% stake in 1980, with Tim Hurley from CH Industrials taking an equal share. Those two became joint owners in 1981, with Gauntlet acting as the executive chairman. Despite the marketing by Pace and the promotion from racing, Aston still struggled, with only 30 cars being made in 1982. Gauntlet sold his share to Peter Livenos. The ownership situation was messy, with Gauntlet still running the company and the different investors changing their stakes in the company. In 1984, Gauntlet would take a 25% stake in the business, due to Livanos having financial problems in his shipping business. The deal saw the company being valued at £2 million, meaning Aston Martin was now worth £6 million less than in 1980. The instability of the business meant they had to lay off 60 workers, although he would buy shares in Zagata, the Italian design company and coach builders. In 1986, Aston Martin returned to the big screens with The Living Daylights, which saw Timothy Dalton driving a Vantage. Big change came in 1987 as Ford bought 75% of the brand and acquired the remaining 25% by 1995. It was looking up for Aston as the Vantage had sold relatively well for them and the economy was no longer so unstable. In 1993, they brought back the most famous name in the brand's history with the DB7's arrival. There was considerable investment from Ford, which led to them producing a record 700 cars in 1995 after Ford opened a new factory to produce the DB7. In 1999, Ford created the Premier Automotive Group, which included brands such as Jaguar, Land Rover, Lincoln and Volvo. New models came for Aston, with the V12 Vantage arriving in 1999 and the Vanquish starting production in 2001. In 2003, a factory in Gaydon was opened, meaning it was the first purpose-built factory in the brand's history. Also that year saw the introduction of the DB9, which replaced the DB7, and a Volante version followed the next year. The V8 Vantage went into production in 2006 and sold relatively well alongside the DB9. In 2004, Aston Martin were given space in the Ford Germany plant to produce engines. They were now able to make 5,000 engines a year, and they could assemble an entire one in under 20 hours. However, in 2006, Ford decided to sell Aston Martin, due to them wanting to sell most of the companies in the Premier Automotive Group. In 2007, a consortium chaired by the chairman of ProDrive, David Richards, bought Aston Martin for £475 million. Ford kept a stake in the business. The Newport Pagnell plant became focused on classic car sales and repairs, so production moved to the Gaydon plant. In 2008, a deal was done which meant that more than 2,000 cars per year would be produced in Austria due to the increased demand for Aston Martins. It seemed to be going well, but as it so often had been, this was short-lived. In December 2008, nearly a third of its workforce was made redundant. The first Rapides were produced in 2010 as Aston tried to appeal to new markets. Invest Industrial, an Italian investment firm who also now own Morgan, bought a 37.5% stake in Aston Martin, which valued the company at £400 million. Later that year, Mercedes signed a deal with the British brand to supply AMG engines. For this role, Mercedes received a 5% stake in the brand, which they later increased to 20% in 2020. With plans to build an SUV and refresh their lineup, £20 million was invested into expanding their plant in Gaydon. However, in 2014, they lost £72 million due to slow sales, although they did receive £200 million from shareholders to help them develop new models. Despite this, they lost over £150 million in 2016. A year later, construction began of a new plant in South Wales. The Newport Pagnell plant also became operational again. Surprisingly this year, they made a profit of £87 million before tax. Aston Martin Lagonda were listed on the London Stock Exchange in 2018. They also opened a new vehicle testing centre at Silverstone and a new facility in London. The factory in St Athan, South Wales, was opened in 2019, ready for the production of the DBX. In January 2020, Lawrence Stroll bought a 16.7% stake in the company, before later increasing it to 20%. It seemed to be going well, but in May 2020, CEO Andy Palmer stepped down after the share price fell by 94%. A month later, Aston Martin announced they were cutting 500 jobs due to poor sales, partly due to the pandemic. In July 2022, Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund took a 16.7% stake, making them the second largest shareholder. Geely acquired a 7.6% stake just a few months later, and since then they have increased their stake to 17%, whilst the U-Tree consortium, headed by Stroll, now owns over 28% of Aston Martin Lagonda. Last month, Lucid signed a deal with the British car maker to supply them with electric motors and batteries in exchange for an undisclosed fee from 3.7% of the company. So it all looks good for the company, with a host of shareholders willing to invest heavily in the expertise of Lucid, Mercedes and Geely. However, it is not as rosy as it seems. Aston Martin has been operating at a loss nearly every year since 2010 and are approximately £1 billion in debt. Despite all the investment they have seen recently, they lost around £500 million last year, despite the added sales of the DBX. Despite promises for electric cars and new models, they have a 52% chance of bankruptcy, meaning there could be another twist in the troubled tale of Aston Martin.